Start recording.
Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone. It's Seth Sanduja from War and News. Today, I'm joined by Tim Kirby, a Russian analyst. He has done a lot of interesting projects in Russia. He has done a lot of documentaries, analyses. He's done a lot of coverage about people of Russia. He's documented quite a number of really fascinating stories. And today I'm here to talk to him about the idea of the Russians pairing with the United States in a common effort to take on China. Can that be done? Is it possible? Is it doable? Or is there any room for convergence between Russia and the United States? Are there any differences that prevent that from happening? What do the Russians think about the Chinese? Is Russia becoming the junior partner of China? So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. So Tim, go ahead.
All right. Well, first off, I'd just like to say it's great to see you again. We haven't talked in a very long time, so this is a nice opportunity to have a friendly chat here. Well, one thing we have to start out with is something that we might call there's the official truth and the actual truth. And this is kind of a hot thing to start this conversation with, so I ask your viewers to give me a little bit of a stretch here. What I'm going to say is what people in power in Russia and China believe, and this may not be true or not, but it's what they believe, okay? Just like if someone believes a different religion than you, that doesn't necessarily mean that your religion is wrong. It means they believe in their religion a lot, okay? And the government of Russia and China, not in the world of conspiracy theories, but in the world of formal declared beliefs, believe that the United States has been attempting to create biological weapons to attack specifically Russians and other Slavs and Chinese in a genetic sense. Now, the why I mention this first is because that is a really, really high barrier to start with if we're going to try to restart and reforge any sort of relationship between Russia and the United States, because when things are at that bad of a level that the government here believes that it was the Washington or some Western elements are trying to genocide them, where do you even begin? Where do you even begin? I can say that if we can somehow get over that hump, if I were in Washington, okay, and it was my job, given that we don't know who's going to be president, we don't know where American politics are going to be, but they say, Tim, here's $1 million, you're going to work for some sort of think tank, your good old Club of Rome, Atlantic Council, maybe even the Hoover Institute, who knows, one of these guys, right? These groups of guys.
No,
you have to come up with a plan that'll work, okay? So I just stated just how bad things are right now.
Sure.
The plan really would rely on Hollywood, because Russians are ultimately very, very easy to sucker in compared to Americans or the Chinese or other people. Russian culture is obsessed with this idea of this sort of like us and them and who's our friend and who isn't. And in a lot of ways, with a lot of Hollywood fluff over a 10-year period, you could really convince Russia, the Russian masses, of pretty much anything, given the right movies and media support. One thing Russians complain about is that very often in Hollywood movies and the big video games, the bad guys are generally either Arabs or sometimes the Chinese or other Asians,
Sure.
but very often the Russians, right? And what if it was sort of the opposite? I think that would really help, because all those times of Russians sort of being accused as being the bad guys or potential terrorists in these video games has also really sort of subconsciously created yet another barrier in which, America and Russia, especially thinking people in Russia, can't really get along. The other barrier also is that, remember, officially, again, I don't know exactly who your audience is, but remember, again, from the Russian perspective, the whole coup, the Maidan coup, was orchestrated by Washington to use Ukraine as an anti-Russian state to essentially weaken and or destroy Russia. So that's another hurdle to get over. But I do believe that with propaganda, Russian people are very, like I said, are very naive. It's kind of ironic that Russians are sort of the great warriors of history,
Yeah.
and yet they're also extremely naive. I don't quite know how to explain this, but it is true. Fighting Russia, bad idea. Is Russia full of people who are shockingly naive? Yes. So yeah, I think it would be a real focus would have to go on the naivete and essentially a transformation of the propaganda in America, not to sort of change like attitudes in the West against Russia, because who cares? To be honest, in my the way I see things at this point, with the way things are in our let's just put it this way. Washington doesn't really need to even worry itself about what the masses in the West think. They're sort of a non-issue. If they really feel it's that important to draw Russia away from China, they actually literally kind of need to make American media to suit Russia.
So, that's interesting. So, I actually think about how there was one Call of Duty video game in particular. It's not coming to mind, but it was involving a war zone where the Americans were battling a evil regime in a Middle Eastern country, and the Russians were there.
Yeah.
These Russians were raping children, essentially, and there was this whole graphic scene, essentially, about this. It was kind of sick and twisted. It was a Call of Duty game. I can't remember which one it was. It was some years ago.
Yeah.
And I was told that Soros has some investments in some of these video game enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed over the years that the Russians have become more and more seen as the bad guys in a lot of these video games, in these first-player shooter video games. And it makes me wonder what that was all about. It looked to me that we in America were being primed to hate the Russians, and this was before the special military operation.
Yeah.
So it's not too much of a shocker that it's been inculcated in the minds of Americans to hate Russians, and you see that especially on the American left, where it is often brought up that the Russians are anti-LGBT5, they're anti-abortion, they're this thing, that thing, whatnot. They're Christian fanatics, supposedly. And it's quite interesting. You see that in the Democratic Party in America, there are more Democrats that support this war against Russia than Republicans. And I suspect it has to do with that liberal ideological bend, all that propaganda and brainwashing that has come from video games and also movies, which is something that the left specializes in, Hollywood, entertainment industry. But I am seeing some hope in the United States that perhaps a dialogue with Russia can occur, and maybe there can be some common bridges, because the way I look at it is this Ukraine conflict is only getting worse. Nukes are now being stationed in Belarus. That's not good. There's talks of Belarus and Poland going at each other's throats. There are conversations on the grapevine that in Kaliningrad there's going to be more nuclear arms, warheads rather. There's all kinds of discussions about giving the Ukrainians even more firepower on behalf of the United States. And it could, start getting into a position where Moscow gets even more and more attacked. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Is America a direct participant in attacking, the capital of Russia? I mean, this is crazy stuff. It's so. I wonder, as this conflict gets worse, how we can try to walk back some of this hostility, how we can try to repair some relations, or do you think it's too far gone? And
well, again, when you're talking about we, you just sort of mentioned more like normal American people or the government, because those are two, I think, very different issues. Like what your statement that you kind of made about how who is closer to your average Russian in a political sense, be they your average Democrat or your average Republican. Your average Republican is way closer on this sort of political spectrum. There's definitely a lot of overlay. In fact, if Putin spoke English without an accent, okay?
Yep.
And if he were to mention, one thing he never talks about is taxation and guns. But if you were to imagine an American politician, right, who never mentions taxations and guns, who's Republican and popular, it's basically Putin. Like, he really has that sort of rhetoric, that sort of style of delivery. Again, a lot of things of being sort of this, like, fist-pounding, I don't know, Hitlerian Rush Limbaugh type are sort of projected on him. If you really watch his interviews, he generally almost never gets angry. He's actually kind of monotone. So, to be honest, I think he really would fit well at the Republican presidential debate, you know, if he could speak English anyways, properly. So, now if we're talking about how people can get along, one thing I've believed for a long time, and I still believe, and I think it was a real triumph that we were able to get the 2022 Russia Bowl, the championship of American football in Russia. We were able to get that on cable television in the United States. I think that was a real triumph. I believe they aired Russia Bowl 2023 with a major large delay, so that one worked. So we're at least able to get one American football game here. Because as you probably know just as well as I do, the real heart and soul of America is our national sport. And it is a lot more popular in Russia than you might think. And so I think if you're talking about just the masses and the sort of like citizens diplomacy, American football is really like the way to go. But then again, we also have to remember that that's American football without so much the help of the NFL, because the NFL, they're at least official sort of, when they start to get a little political, they are very much in line with the State Department. You know, they're like your BLM, got your LGBT, we've got your volunteer work that accomplishes nothing that makes people feel good, we've got your make the NFL players wear their pink socks or whatever it is once a year. You know, the NFL is very much, unfortunately, I don't want to say in cahoots, but submissive to the sort of woke status quo. So you can't expect that much out of them. If we're talking about other stuff, one thing I also try to bring up with a lot of people is that you can buy a gun in Russia, which is another thing that no one believes. Although gun culture in America is way bigger than in Russia, it still exists here. I think guns and shooting, you know, are definitely things that could unite Americans. Hunting, well, conservatives anyways. The fact that Russians, after COVID happened, there's been a real large mass migration from Russians from living in apartments to living in houses. In fact, Russia's really experiencing a surge in the construction and movement towards single-family homes. As in, you know, the single-family home is like the American standard. I should probably say, actually, the Anglo-Saxon standard, because, well, in England they have a lot of townhouses, but it's basically a single-family home. But if you go to the English-speaking countries, that's really our thing, and now Russians are really moving in that direction. So that's another thing that I think really brings us together. Yeah, and in fact, to be honest,
my question is more specifically geared to this military conflict.
Oh, to the military?
Where do you see it? Yeah, that's what I brought up earlier, which is, you know, we're seeing, you know, Belarus getting more aggressive and hostile with Poland. Poland is doing the same with Belarus. There are nukes now stationed in Belarus. We're seeing Moscow come under attack. We're seeing politicians in the West talking about giving Ukraine more weapons, vehicles, to basically use it in the way they please. And they're going to probably use it against Moscow. Where do you see this conflict heading? Will it continue to escalate? Is there room for it to kind of wind down? What do you think?
Well, I think a lot of that sort of depends on Washington. If tomorrow Washington pulls out, it's over, because the Ukrainians don't have any actual real... In fact, I think they don't have any more production of anything of their own. They're 100% reliant on funding from NATO nations in terms of actually keeping their government afloat and keeping their military machine in order. Now, there's this theory, especially if anyone's a fan of Colonel Douglas McGregor, that he says that one of the main things that the Russians are doing is they're going extremely slow because they don't want to lose a lot of guys. That's where I agree with him. Now, where I kind of disagree with him, as he says, is because the West doesn't really want to provoke, Putin doesn't want to provoke a radical response from the West. As in, if Russia were to act too fast, then the West might, things might go out of control. I think he might be kind of right on that. There is a certain Russian logic that a bad situation that's understood is better than a potentially good situation that isn't understood. It's also a very Russian way of viewing the world. But I think a lot of it is that you have to go back and read a book called Putin versus Putin, which has been translated in English. And it's about how sometimes Putin does things that seem really patriotic and bold and dramatic. And then sometimes he kind of follows your international status quo, or he's never a person to really, he's not the kind of person who likes to go, $100, I'm just going to all ride on black, spin the wheel. That is exactly not his approach. The Putin way of thinking would be to work out the calculations for roulette in advance, do various different forms of like spread betting, to go to the casino at $1,000 and come back with $1,075. That's really the way his sort of mentality works. So I think in a lot of ways, the situations that are happening with the way the war is going are a lot more connected to maybe Putin himself and his worldview, maybe more so than being a reflection of Russia as a state itself. Now, again, this might sound not nice, but I beg your audience to sort of understand me that the faster the war were to have gotten over, the less people would have died. So keep that in your mind. I've been on Russian television a few times, and they've asked me about, like, well, what do the Americans think about this? What are their perceptions? And I try to tell them that one of the main problems that Russia's had is that life in Kiev can be portrayed as normal. Okay? So, yeah, something strikes Kiev, but ultimately they've really tried to focus the fighting on the actually destroying the Ukrainian armed forces and their airstrips, their arms production. There were definitely some attacks on their electrical infrastructure to kind of break it, to really kind of put them to sleep. But ultimately, life in Kiev can be sort of filmed as being normal. And I try to explain to them that our politicians view the world in a very Hollywood way. And that the real only issue, I think, that would end the war from the Russian standpoint would be, once Kiev falls, it's over. If they would have melted Kiev, not with a nuclear bomb, but with other types of bombs, and Kiev would have been essentially destroyed on video within the first few weeks, this would have been over. At least that's the way I see, the way our politicians view the world. Because they would have been like, oh, okay, I'm seeing the footage of this, the capital has fallen, it's over, time to surrender. They don't think about things in some sort of like World War II Stalin, let's retreat behind the Ural Mountains, and if we have to sacrifice this city, we will. And all this fighting over places that no one has ever heard of and can't pronounce. That's not, essentially, long story short, Kiev has gone into this, or the West, or whatever, very, very focused on PR. But the Russians don't understand that very, PR way of looking at things is the prism through which our Western politicians generally view the world. And that if they want to send a message back, they have to sort of speak in that more PR language. And that's one of the reasons why the war is going to continue to go on, because the Russians refuse this. Because trust me, man, every time I've tried to explain this on TV, I'm always sort of left with, yeah, as being the response. And I speak Russian very well. It's not that I sound like a stupid foreign person. They just cannot comprehend that, again, the entire, all the things about this war that come from the State Department are always about the optics. Always about the optics, the visual, how this is going to look, how this is going to be perceived. And so those type of people don't respond to reality. They're not interested in reality. They're interested in what the piece of paper in front of them is, what's written on it, and what kind of visions they can dream up for all this stuff. So, about getting the war to be over, the Russians are not going to do what it takes to do that, because they absolutely refuse to engage in any sort of PR, something or other, or fighting the war to make it look a certain. They're just not going to do that. and the West seems to essentially be very happy with fighting the war based on PR optics and based on taking actions that are in response to what's written on the piece of paper in front of them. Who cares if there's any legitimate information on that piece of paper?
Interesting. What I'd like to understand from you is where do you think this conflict is going to go? Like from this point forward? I mean, there's not really much change in the battle maps here, or not. There's not much change in the maps here. You know, nothing has. You know, Kharkov hasn't. You know, come back to the Russians. Kherson, you know, is gone. That's gone for the Russians. You know, all these attacks on Crimea from Ukraine hasn't really materialized in anything substantial. Like it's just infrastructure going here nor there. These drone attacks on Moscow, they're hitting soft targets. It's almost a form of, you know, terrorism.
Yeah.
Although one could say the attacks on Kiev by Russia is terrorism. What do you think? You know, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. I don't know. I just wonder, like, what would be the next thing that would happen? I mean, what do the Russians think? Are they going to consider their own counteroffensive? I've been reading that in Russian media that there's a talk of starting a new counteroffensive this fall, and it would go through the spring.
One thing, what part of the Russian media are you referring to? Who specifically? I mean, trust me, I don't have a picture perfect memory, but like, are you talking more the blogosphere or like the mainstream news sources or what?
So there's these talks of a Russian counteroffensive on the military blogs, and it's been also like mused by some of these officials. They call them unknown officials in the Russian bureaucracy.
No.
And I just wondered what you thought about that.
I think that might be falling into that. Remember that there's in every country, I think there's a lot of people who are sort of that armchair quarterback, or I guess in this instance, armchair general. And when it comes from the blogosphere, if they're talking about that someone tipped them off from inside the system,
that's right.
That has a lot more validity than you get like that guy, Igor Strelkov, who actually got arrested recently, who was like, we're losing the war, we have to make an infantry charge and all this stuff. When with those people, you really can't listen to them because they tend to really take this thing in a very emotional way rather than in some sort of grand strategy, pragmatic, knowing things on the inside way. So it's kind of hard to comment precisely. But I'll tell you one thing, if you want to talk about Russia, is if let's just say Joe Biden changes his mind tomorrow and the people around him, and they say, okay, enough's enough, we found our exit ramp to this, let's just end the war where it is now. Within Russian society, there's going to be a loud response is going to be like, Odessa, Kharkov.
Yeah. That's right. They want that too.
You know, to Putin, it'll be to Putin. Boss, where are they? Boss. Because some of the other stuff of whether Kiev is partially takeable or entirely takeable, some of these cities that are sort of in the exact middle of Ukraine are very kind of, I'll put it this way, loyalty and ethnicity could kind of go either way. But when it comes to Kharkov and Odessa, maybe even Odessa even more, there is definitely a big thing. And also, for our conspiracy theories friends, Odessa is also the more fascinating region because we have to remember that Zelensky is of a certain religious ethnic origin, but the people of that same religious ethnic origin in Odessa have really gotten the repression hammer about as bad as the Russians have. And so the people in Russia who are also part of that group are definitely pulling for Odessa to come back home, if that makes any sense. So that's a deep one going there. But so yeah, I think that the powers that be in Russia, again, because I mentioned about Putin has this sort of the book Putin versus Putin says that there's a solar and a lunar Putin, as the author puts it. Solar Putin being sort of the good guy, and lunar Putin being the more disappointing guy. And you never know. Lunar Putin could be very happy. We got 4 new states. The border's been pushed farther away from the Crimea. Who knows? He might take the deal in order to save more lives. But the populace wants blood. And that's one thing that's also sort of the opposite.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Because I've seen a lot of public polling, a lot of reliable public polling that Council on Foreign Relations even views as reliable. They say that at least 70% of the Russian people support the war, if not more. Yeah. And I was very surprised to read that it was that high. And I wonder, like, what it would like. Why is it like that high? What do you think?
Well, one thing that's sort of hard for people to explain is, you know how in America we have a news cycle, how like something will come up, it'll become kind of the top issue, and then it kind of loses interest, and then here comes the next thing, and there's this sort of, I don't know, like waves where something becomes the most important thing in the public consciousness, and then the wave goes down. Like, what's that? There's the crest of the wave is the top, and then what's the bottom of the wave? I know there's a term for it, but who cares? Okay, so that's kind of how our society in the West works. Since 2014 till present, there has been one wave, and that wave has been the problems in Ukraine. We could call it the Ukrainian crisis because obviously it existed before the war. In Russia, this has been, and I cannot stress you that this isn't just an important issue. It has been issue number 1 by far and away. And every person in Russia, especially if they have social media, is reminded every 2nd of May about the murders of the people who are the pro-Russian protesters who are murdered in Odessa every year. About the Alley of Angels, which was the place that to honor all the little children that were killed by the anti-terrorist operation launched by Kiev against the Donbass locals. Everyone in the country knows all about that. So essentially everything that happened with this whole Maidan, the rise of their sort of fascism and all that, it has been, I don't know, it's kind of like, oh boy, what would it be for Americans? It'd be like someone who isn't familiar with this, it'd be like going to an American and saying, hey, do you want ketchup with your fries? And they're like, what is this ketchup thing? What is this ketchup thing you're referring to? Is this some sort of sauce? Like everyone, it's ubiquitous doesn't even begin to describe it.
Okay, it's interesting. So what I was told was that this war is really popular because of the fact the Russians view this as an existential crisis, in that their immediate borders are being shelled, they're under attack, the fate of the Russian language is also under attack, and their way of life, essentially, this porous border between Russia and Ukraine that has historically been a free-flowing border is also under attack. There's this understanding and idea that it's not just that, Ukraine would be in NATO if this, if Russia, didn't do anything, but more importantly, it would be NATO coming into the Black Sea and interfering with Russia's warm water port. And the concern is the power balance shifting dramatically. And, Russia has lost a lot of its edge against Europe and the collective West. And the worry is that, the ships in Sevastopol and in the Black Sea would start being checked by, a very aggressive Ukraine backed by NATO in that region. And it's only because, and as it is right now, Turkey has, access to that region, but Russia and Turkey have an understanding of not, going at each other's throats over this, and allowing for the transit of trade and goods and services. But I don't know if that is the level of thought people have when they look into this war in Russia, or is it like very simplistic, Russian language is under attack and it's
Okay. Well,
identitarianism.
I think you're
Or
going to have to sort of divide people into two groups.
okay,
I think in every society, there's sort of a more top thinking sort of echelon. I don't know what percent of the population that would be, but let's just put it
okay,
this way. There's a lot of people around you right now who don't really think a whole heck of a lot about much, but they seem to still have a lot of opinions, right? And then you also have your guys who are probably waking up every morning and they're like, oh my gosh, I've got to listen to the Henry Kissinger just wrote a letter to someone. I got to read it, you know? And for those people who are obsessed with, like reading Henry Kissinger's letters, for them, a lot of the more geopolitical things you just mentioned are very important about
okay.
Russia and about the seaports and about having more of a buffer zone from NATO and about getting an established security agreement. Trust me, man, I've met plenty of people who that is very important to them, okay? And one thing for your viewers to note, the closest I actually think we've ever gotten in human history to a real nuclear war was not the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the annexation, as they like to call it, of the Crimea, because that was the moment when Solar Putin appeared in full form, and one of the reasons why the Russians moved in and did the referendum and took back the Crimea, what you have to understand is, because without it, Russia would essentially cease to exist as a power. So Russia said, basically, that was a game of nuclear chicken, and Russia went and just put a brick on the gas pedal.
Question: why do you think Russia would not be a great power without this Crimea? Explain why.
Well, losing access to the Black Sea essentially completely would really box Russia in even more. And again, I've heard so many different things about Russia's ports. Like, everyone's like, but the Sevastopol is the only real port that doesn't freeze over. And I don't really think that's true, but I'll put it this way. Vladivostok and Murmansk are really far away, as is St. Petersburg, but I think St. Petersburg sometimes freezes over. I'm not an expert on naval stuff. But from a Russian standpoint, it would really essentially, the Russia relies on having a Baltic Sea fleet, a Northern Sea fleet, as in the Arctic, a Pacific fleet around Vladivostok, and the Black Sea. And essentially, these four fleets are sort of defend Russia in four directions, and essentially delete one of those fleets and really, really march Russia back, because Russia has had access to the Black Sea since when? Maybe Ivan the Terrible or before?
Hundreds of years ago.
Hundreds of years. And it's a real, people believe, or I should say the experts believe, that it's one sort of key aspect. It's kind of like, would America be as rich if it would have just kind of been happy with the Louisiana Purchase and had only access to one ocean? Or is America wealthier and more powerful because it has access to two oceans? We wouldn't really know unless we tried it. Don't try it, America, by the way. That's a bad idea. It's kind of one of those things. But again, you asked earlier, just started to cut you off, but you asked earlier about the average population. But yeah, the populace, they're more concerned about the attacks on Russian culture, that they feel that there's a genocide being waged against them, not just in terms of maybe diseases, but a cultural genocide. They're very afraid of wokeism taking over, and they really, as Putin called Russia or Ukraine, he refers to it as being why it had to be attacked was it became not just like some sort of country, but an anti-Russia. And that whole thing of Ukraine being this anti-Russia could definitely be felt. Furthermore, because there's so many people who are interrelated with Ukraine, you have no idea. I think there's more were before the war anyways, more relatives, business interactions than maybe even between America and Canada. Maybe even multiple times. So trust me, all the suffering that was happening to Russian people for being Russian in Ukraine, everybody here heard about it through their cousins and aunts and somebody's boyfriend and this, that, and the other. It's a little bit different when the Iraqis were suffering because they all speak Arabic for the most part, right? And it's not like everyone has a cousin, Ahmed or Habib, in Baghdad, right? Whereas, again, if some horrible incident was, again, happening in Canada, right? Trust me, in America, we'd be hearing a lot about it through the grapevine.
Well, we already have a good example when the Texans, when the Texans were being attacked, the settler colonial Texans were being attacked by the Mexican government. America really, helped out those Texan secessionists.
Yeah.
And, when the Republic of Texas was also under threat by the Mexican government, America came in to essentially help them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons for the US-Mexican War, though not the sole reason, of course. And also not to mention the fact that, America and Texas wanted to be together. And obviously the Mexicans didn't want that. And that's another reason why this conflict started, although that's not the sole reason, and there are many other factors. So I can see almost apples to apples comparisons with these secessionist regions of Ukraine, like Donbass and Crimea. But what I want to understand is, and I get this question a lot, and it's something I haven't been able to quite understand. People tell me, well, if Russia is complaining about this country called Ukraine becoming in NATO, and this Ukraine would be just another NATO country on Russia's borders. What's the big deal? You already have, the Baltic states on Russia's borders. What's the big deal? You have Poland, another NATO country, very hostile, anti-Russian NATO country on Russia's borders.
Yeah. The border of Kaliningrad, but yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah, I mean, that's Russian, right? People forget that Russia borders Poland. And what's another country? Ukraine. What's the big deal? Why is Ukraine unique?
Well,
why is
because
unique?
I think because Estonia has 10 tanks. I think that's a large part of the reason where, this model of the, again, this is probably for some of your viewers are not going to like my opinion about some of the actions of the State Department, because maybe they feel they were justified after the end of communism. But anyways, communism ends. And you'll notice one thing. If you were able to travel along the former Soviet Union or talk to everyone from every former Soviet republic, universally, somehow, by some means, I think it was through State Department influence, perhaps I'm wrong, there's this belief among them all, especially during the early 90s, that the real reason that all those countries are poor or have problems is because of Russia. That if it wasn't for Russia, that if it wasn't for Russia, they would be super rich and super amazing, and that they need to and that the Russian language in those countries is some sort of form of oppression, while everyone needs to learn English because it's the international language. Those countries, they need to restrict the amount of Russian movies and TV shows getting there, translated Hollywood movies all day long. So it's completely universal. The difference with Ukraine is that, one, vastly bigger population-wise and military-wise, and number two, the real sort of hatred of Russians was able to click there. The Baltic states do have a lot of people who sympathize with the Third Reich, but to be honest, it kind of winds up with them. They don't even really do tiki torch parades. It just kind of winds up with some people like to cosplay for certain dates out of the year. Yeah, they do everything they can to shut down every Russian language school in the Baltics. This is bad. I don't know if they ever resolved that issue where many of the people who are ethnically Russian were considered resident aliens and never actually given citizenship of the Baltics. So there was a lot of that stuff, but it never went to the whole, real Third Reich, we're going to kill you level that it did with Ukraine. And even in Kazakhstan, we definitely see some videos of people behaving in a very racist way towards Russian and stuff, and Russians. But something about Ukraine is it sort of had that, it's not lightning in a jar. Basically, the perfect combination of factors to create the anti-Russia that the other real republics of the former Soviet Union kind of weren't able to do. Like even in, for example, I believe it was in Armenia, where they had a lot of protests saying, Russians, get out of here. Russians are the occupiers. Then I think they kind of canceled flights to Armenia, and they were like, why are you canceling flights? Why don't you? We want to have tourists. Like, there's sort of a more of a cognitive dissonance with them, whereas with Ukraine, it is 100% murder. It is 100%. They're the enemy. They're tainted by the Mongols. I should say we're tainted by the Mongols. We are non-Europeans, and therefore we deserve to die. but somehow LGBT is also awesome and open borders are cool too. So there you go.
Yeah, I just find this a little strange because, I think when Poland joined NATO, the Russian response was not so aggressive as we see with Ukraine. Now, I understand it was a different time then when Russia was very desperate for money, desperate for trade with the West. They really wanted to bury the hatchet because the Cold War was so devastating for humanity and devastating between the relations of Russia and the United States. But and the Poles at the time, they weren't as hostile to the Russians. Like today's Poland is much more.
Dude, I don't know about that, man. I know a lot of Polish people. Or at least, excuse me, kind of spit there. I know a lot of Polish people. Poland is permanently hostile towards Russia, man.
Yeah, they have beef. There's no doubt about it. But to the extent that we see today, where you're seeing real serious conversations about taking back all the lands, going back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that is something I would think is a bit normal. It's weird because that used to be a fringe line. Now it's like in the mainstream. Back in the day, Poland was talking about their freedom, their existence as a nation, and how they needed NATO so that Russia could never again interfere in their affairs. Today, some of the mainstream sentiment in Poland is we want to get all our lands back.
Yeah. Well, because the opportunity arose to do so. I mean,
Correct.
Before this war happened, well, it just was never anything that would be viable. I mean, let's go back. When did Poland join NATO? Was that 2007 or 1997 or somewhere?
I recall it was much earlier than that. Let me double check.
Even earlier than 97.
No. So let's see. When did they join? They joined in 1999 under Clinton.
99, okay. Well, that was at the very moment where a lot of Russians actually feel guilty because essentially Russia was too weak to protect the Serbs, and that is something that's a real guilt trip on the Russian conscience, that they were completely defeated and couldn't do anything. So even back then, let's just go back to that sort of moment in history.
Let's talk about it.
This post-communist Poland, joins NATO. I think imperial ambitions were just not on the horizon. I think now this war has really opened the opportunity to say they can see that this whole Ukraine thing is going to fall apart at some point, and that they can take it back. Trust me, I don't blame them. And to be honest, Poland is kind of a lighter anti-Russia in some ways, but they're not like the Ukrainians are. And I understand that there's this sort of Polish identity is really focused on interpreting history as Poland being the defenders of Europe. Like Poland kept the Ottomans out. Poland fought against the communists. Yeah, World War II was a bit too much. But then during the Warsaw Pact days, it was the Poles who were really on the streets protesting to fight against communism. And that all of us are a lot happier when we find a function and purpose in life. And for Poland, it's being the eastern border of Europe. And to be honest, my brother, I'm happy with that, sitting in Russia. I'd love Poland to go in, eat all of Western Ukraine, and establish that this is now, the end of Europe. Poland is the frontier lands, as in Ukraine means borderlands, basically.
Yeah.
But, they're the new Ukraine in the sense of being the borderlands. They can feel pride in that. But at the same time, we can also say, hey, this is the East, this is the West. Now let's try to maybe build peace or some sort of agreement about this. Or who knows, maybe we'll just build a huge wall and trenches between each other or some sort of new Maginot Line. Who knows? But I have no problem with that. I think that'd be a fantastic resolution of the conflict because I think it would allow people to sort of get what they want, more or less.
So one thing I know about you in our conversations is you've been to the Duma, you have contacts, you know people.
Yeah.
What is the general sentiment amongst the rank and file politicians there? Yeah. What do they want in terms of this conflict? Where are they willing to go? How far are they willing to escalate? What are their thoughts? What is the general sentiment?
Oh, well, if you want to talk about the general sentiment of any politician is
Sure.
what they want, but they don't. This isn't what they could put into words because I would say that they all find themselves in the quagmire that is Western style democracy. Is that they all have visions for what they want to do, but they're all
Yes.
impossible to get done. The Western system is on purpose to be bureaucratic, to essentially be this barrier against tyranny or some sort of quick bad action and taking away your rights. I can understand that, but essentially, every Russian politician you meet is they have all these ideas and all these projects and all this, and they can never get anything accomplished. And so they tend to have a very good dark sense of humor, all of them, because they essentially know that they're going to be fighting the good fight only to lose. So that's about that. When it comes to the war, the problem is they know that anything they say to me could get published somewhere. So they tend to be, I think, somewhere between let's get this over with, which is what the populace works, and we should have faith in the emperor. And so something like that. Generally nothing too revealing. I would say it's more revealing about how even people who are extremely powerful seem to feel somewhat impotent when it comes to being able to make change.
Do the Duma members actually like Putin? They actually love this guy?
Yeah, he's really, really straight, legit popular.
Really?
And yeah, because no one can even conceive of who could be able to be as broadly popular as he is. For you know what I mean? That's one of the big questions is who's going to replace him, and there's really no candidates. You know, so yeah, but no, he is legit popular.
Interesting. Let's talk about China. I don't have much time. I'm not sure about yours. But
cool. You let me know, man.
Cool. I have like 15 minutes or so. And thank you for your time, by the way. Thank you.
What's up? Anything for you, baby?
Oh, you're sweet. I'd like to know from you, what is Russian sentiment towards the Chinese right now? Let's hear your thoughts, because you talk to a lot of big influencers, policymakers. Tell me,
well, to
please.
be honest, people are very happy about this whole new friendship stuff. The one thing that we were kind of talking about before the interview is there really isn't that much China paranoia. The problem is there's people who believe everything they read on the internet, and there's definitely a campaign where they try to spread this rumor. I'm pretty sure it's probably CIA, State Department, try to spread this rumor that the Chinese are taking over like every city around Russia. First off, the overwhelming majority of the territory of China itself is not full. China also has a lot of ghost cities that are empty. There's a lot of space left in China. Second, Russia's really cold. Third, I've traveled to everywhere around the Chinese border, and there are no Chinese, like, suburbs or anything like that. Obviously, there's a lot of businesses between them. If you go to the river between Blagoveshchensk and, what is that place called in China? Oh, no, I can't remember the name of the Chinese city, but Blagoveshchensk, maybe I can find it on a map. Hold on, let's see.
Sure.
Let's see, hold on. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Blagoveshchensk. There we go. Blagoveshchensk city in Russia. Oh, it's Hey, China. That's the way it's written in Russian, as in like hey, anyways, if you go there and you look at that river, first off, they built a new, very large bridge that's designed only for semi-trucks. So it's like it's extra wide lanes. All day long, semis going. You see barges going across. You see, because what do the Russians give the Chinese? They built a power plant by that city just to send power to China. All the power goes to China. They're sending soy. The soy fields around Blagoveshchensk are huge. And you just see like one barge of like soy go to China, and then one barge of excavators and tractors go to Russia. You can see the process with your own eyes. It's pretty crazy, you know? And the nice part is on the Chinese side, there's all sorts of advertisements in Russian because they want Russians to go there to shop. I don't know. There must be good deals. But anyways, so that's just kind of one thing that I noticed. But essentially, there is sort of a fear plot on the internet to say that the Russians or the Chinese have taken over all the Russian cities in the Far East. But it's not only not partially true, it's 0% true. So that's number one. But about average people, I think a lot of people are very happy to, again, with this whole Russians are kind of naive. Generally, this thing of let's be friends is always a good marketing thing. And of course, people would much, much rather have a friendly relationship with China based on what they feel to be mutual respect rather than what's happening with the United States. Again, here's a perfect example. Remember, Hillary Clinton, during the presidential campaign when she was taking on Trump, she said that the Russians were evil. Trump said, I'll work with them. So guess who became real popular in Russia? And this is kind of the same thing. If the West has completely rejected Russia and China says, hey, we'll work with you, that's a good thing. So I would say that generally there's a lot of positive vibes about China. And there really hasn't been too much public backlash to the fact that now, rather than having everything written in Russian and English, it's now Russian, English, Chinese. All the cars here almost are either Russian or Chinese. A lot of things have become Chineseified, if that's a word.
Oh God. Yes,
Sinified. Very quickly. So yeah, but I think that generally most people support that. But again, I think it also has to do with the fact that the Chinese are sort of distant. And again, it's always easier to be friends with someone who is a little bit distant, It's easy to have good relations with any country that you don't border, although Russia does border it. But again, if you look at the borders, they're kind of empty. So, yeah.
But the thing that I just don't understand why it's not inculcated in the minds of Russians is the fact that the Chinese are very resource thirsty. They're looking for water. They're looking for places to expand into. The Far East is desolate, but it has a lot of resources.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Chinese companies in that Far East that are trying to exploit that land. Exploit as in take from it and utilize. And what I don't understand is this swing in which the Russians were always cautious about preserving their sovereignty, their ability to be autonomous amongst their partners, not being too dependent. Now I'm noticing that the Russians are just going full out on this Chinese relationship. They're trading like crazy, and it's almost like they're so desperate. Putin talks about, all right, we're gonna go to the Asians now. And the Chinese, they have border disputes with almost everybody around them. The Chinese have talked about restoring like the lands that they had under the Qing dynasty. And back in the COVID times, there were Chinese bureaucrats, people who were close to the bureaucracy, Chinese academics and thinkers close to the government, talking about getting some of these old lands back. And the thing is, now we can say, well, let's have, China and Russia have buried the hatchet. They've got these deals, blah, blah, blah. Thing, though, is that the Chinese have sinified a lot of the Russian towns and regions on their maps. And I find that very fascinating because that shows to me they still have this irredentist agenda. They still have these desires
one of the problems is with their language, I think they have to sinify everything because they can't phonetically express things. So a lot of things have what would be sinification to them because that's just kind of the way their language works. So I'm not quite sold on that one. But what you said about Russians wanting to be independent, not in the 90s. In the 90s, Russia was on its knees with great joy. As Putin even revealed right before the war there, or right after it, that Russia, which was always known and rumored, but he confirmed it, that Russia desperately wanted to join NATO in the 90s. Russia was absolutely overall, and this is something Russians are going to be ashamed of for many future generations, but Russia was thrilled to be conquered in the 90s. That's one of the reasons why Russia fell to sort of internal treason, because of the ability of the West to really convince the Russian elite and a lot of the masses to, betray the system. So the Russians being fanatically battling for sovereignty, to be honest, Russia's only really sovereign because the West rejected it. More so than Russia was able to sort of fight it, if that makes sense. Another thing that's the real big difference between the West and China is that Russians, like I mentioned, are naive, and Russians have had an inferiority complex to the West since Peter the Great. So we're talking over 300 years of this inferiority complex, which permeates everything in Russian society. The war in Ukraine and the last maybe 10 years of, especially the migration crisis, the wokeness in Europe, Europe's hatred for itself have definitely helped alleviate this inferiority complex that Russians have, but it's still there. And so Russians are very easily suckered in by Europe because they all believe that Europe, it doesn't matter who they are, whether they're high-ranking politicians or whether they're the janitor, they still, for the most part, believe the West is superior and that there's just something kind of weird going on in the West right now. They do not feel that way about the Chinese. So when it comes to China, the Russia and anyone else, Africans, Arabs, who knows, Indians, Russians behave in a very rational way because they're not in the status of feeling inferior or looking at them with rose-colored glasses. All of a sudden, when you talk to anyone who's outside of Western Europe, it's realpolitik, mutual respect, and all this stuff. So the attitude towards China is just completely and inherently different and inherently more pessimistic and realistic.
Yeah, see, the thing is, there are certain lands that once upon a time the Chinese owned that they lost to the Russians. And it was recently that the Chinese have actually are using the old names. I'll just give some quick examples. I have an article here. I'm going to butcher the hell out of the pronunciation.
Well, yeah. Chinese is a rough one.
So I mean, like, for example, they have I'm going to butcher the Russian, and I'm very sorry. Let's see, Usterisk with Shuangchengzi. Another example, Khabarovsk with Buri. Then there's Blagoveshchensk with, thank you, Halenvolo. Then they have Sakhalin with Kupan. Then there's Nirchsink with Nibchu, and so on and so forth.
Well, yeah, one thing is they've absolutely never had control over Sakhalin, ever. Okay? So, but again, with the way their language works, they literally cannot just, so I forget what they call a lot of countries, but it's not a phonetic thing. Like, they're not trying to say, like, Buragoveshinska. Like, they don't say Blagoveshchensk. It's just completely different because of that. That's why a lot of Chinese people they'll be like, hi, my name is David Wong, because they are just feel that it's normal. In fact, if you were to live in China, you would actually have to pick a Chinese name for yourself because there's no mechanism to make your name fit their system. So again, I'm not super sold on that. And again, hold on. And the deal between the Russians and the Chinese about where the borders are actually goes back to the 1600s. So this is a really long-established border. It's a long-established border with a nuclear power. The Chinese have so many people, let's just say, for example, in Malaysia, okay? There's still plenty of room there. And like I mentioned, most of China itself is empty. And furthermore, the regions you described don't have oil. Like, they're not even, if something were to happen, they're not going to go up there and become the next Saudis. You know, it's not going to work like that. Yeah.
So actually, Sakhalin was a part of the Qing Empire. And I actually have a French map from 1821 showing it. Thing is,
that very much contradicts the Russian history I've heard. So,
well, I mean, the thing is that, one thing that I really think the Russians are being respectfully naive about this. If you look at the situation in India right now, there are parts of India that the Chinese are claiming to be theirs.
Yeah.
And they've Sinified a lot of these places on their maps.
Yeah.
And they've been upping the ante. They've been saying, oh, this region is called this. And then they would then say, well, because it's called this, Well, why is it called this? Because once upon a time it used to belong to us. Okay, now we're going to claim this now. You see how that ratchets up. So
Well,
it goes from here is a region that we're going to call, whatever a Chinese name is, and because there might have been some kind of connection, to then, hey, wait a minute, this region used to belong to us. We need to make a legal claim over it, to then making it official. Hey, this whole region belongs to China. And it's very interesting because when I read in 2020 or so these tweets from these Chinese academics associated and allied to the government,
yeah.
they were complaining that their maps showed certain cities that were not in Chinese. And they'd say, hey, this used to belong to us once upon a time. The Russians took it away from us. Why aren't we renaming it? And that's when some of the ball got rolling to change more and more of these names. And there's still talks now about getting these lands back. Now, obviously, the politicians of China do not talk about this anymore.
Yeah.
But the establishment that's associated still muses about it. And I wonder if the Russians are concerned about this at all.
It's hard to say, but you also have to understand that Russia is a very different... I'll put it this way. If they tried to do that, all the people who would be involved in that process of trying to, go to somewhere, put enough people there to make it look like they then control it, those people would vanish forever, if you catch my drift.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different ball game.
The other thing is that the BRI is being more and more developed. It's expanding. There's the Eurasian space that's essentially being taken by the Chinese, influenced by the Chinese. There's the SEO, which is almost in competition with there's like the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, I've read a lot of white papers on the subject. Basically, there used to be hostility between Russia and China over this. Now there's kind of like an understanding that they're not going to be in competition. The EAEU with SCO and BRI, they're going to work together. They're going to kind of link them together.
Yeah, and also the Eurasian Economic Union has been a little bit of kind of a failure. I think they really were sort of hoping to essentially kind of reunite the former territories of the Soviet Union into one thing. But then you don't have the Baltics, and obviously without Ukraine and Moldova, it's really... it's not sort of big enough. But the SCO I always thought was more focused on security issues, more so than economic issues.
The SCO, the way it works is it's not a collective security pact like Warsaw Pact or NATO. The way it works is it talks about internal domestic security matters and how that spills over to the borders of these fellow countries and how they can coordinate in taking care of those internal affairs. There's an economic component to it. There's banking, there's finance, there's all of that. But it's definitely very Sinocentric. And what I was trying to get to was this idea that the Russians, yes, they've lost their European partners. It's devastating. They haven't lost all the contracts. The Russians and Americans, they're at loggerheads. That thing is not going to improve anytime soon. They are, yes, expanding their influence in Africa, but they don't have that kind of purchasing power as, say, Europe. Yeah. Yes, they're expanding with India, but same story, purchasing power. It's not the same as the Europeans who are super wealthy. The Chinese are realistically the only country on earth that can displace the United States. They have the military budgets, they have the economic prowess, they have the influence over the globe to do this. Everyone knows that China can take over. Are the Russians okay with that? Are they okay with, yes, America is bad for them. Are they okay with the Chinese? Because, once the Chinese take over...
The Chinese can't really take over because they're incapable of making the sort of... they can't make the media necessary to take over. And furthermore, it looks like China's going to be going into decline itself pretty soon, if it hasn't already. So one of the main things too about the whole like BRICS thing and all this stuff is that Russia is only okay with a multipolar world. They're not okay with a monopolar world of America or a monopolar world of China. They're not particularly thrilled with if we're going to be in some sort of, again, new Cold War where it's the West against everyone. That's also undesirable. The real foreign policy mission is to create a true multipolar world. That's the objective. So this,
What?
yeah.
Sure.
You're,
What are the thoughts in Russia about the BRI,
what do you
Belt
mean
and Road
BRI?
Initiative? What do the Russians think about China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, the Belt and Road Initiative. That's what you mean.
BRI.
Most people support it. I mean, why not make money on shipping? But again, this one, it doesn't really come up a lot, other than it's sort of a necessity to spite the West.
Interesting.
Because, I mean, everyone understands that the West could choke off China's shipping through the South China Sea at some point. If they really wanted to, they could probably do it. That might trigger World War III. But the Belt and Road Initiative seems to be working out because everything that's being built between, say, another good example, the new set of is it a train or a highway? It's something that's like Moscow to Tehran. Goes like sort of a bit through the Caspian Sea or around it.
Yes,
I mean,
know
stuff
what you're
like
talking
that.
about.
It's mutually beneficial, and it benefits sort of everyone who's involved. And you also have to understand that, remember, one thing about Russia is that Russia is not a culture that's very contractual based. So you can't really do something like go up to a Russian person and offer them something that sounds really cool, and then you make them sign this contract, and then the contract actually turns out to be not that great, and the Russians like, oh no, we're gonna only make a tiny amount of money, and the Chinese are gonna make a ton of money off of this Belt and Road Initiative. Oh no, we lost this one. They'll just be like, fuck you, no. Contracts here mean nothing, absolutely nothing as part of the culture. So again, it's some certain positive aspects of Russia that, like, things that were, for example, in the West, things that don't matter, borders. In Russia, the borders are absolutely, completely militarized. You try to break through, you're dead. Okay? Despite the fact that this is a huge, huge amount of borders. So that's one aspect. The whole thing about contracts and business attitude here, which is completely different. So in some ways, I think it's kind of really hard for an American audience to understand. But in that way, Russia can kind of only screw itself over through corruption. It's very hard to screw Russia over because, things here are a little bit more flexible. It's not going to be like, they don't do stuff like the United States where they're like agree to not go to war with someone and attack them or something like that. But for the most part, everything here is kind of flexible, and yeah. So I don't know. I don't really see much paranoia about China from particularly anyone. But one thing we also have to understand is that Russia has a lot of Chinese experts. So although probably Russia really knows what's happening in the West better, everything, including these people, these certain intellectuals you mentioned earlier, everyone here knows about that. There are no secrets from Russia. And its massive information translation machine and analysis machine. Everyone knows about that. But one thing I'd like to also present to you is that in I'll put it this way, since you seem to know more about India than I could ever possibly know, are there any sort of weird or extremist groups in India?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, there's far-right groups, there's far-left groups. I mean, there's...
Well, and how do you determine which one of these type of groups, which ones really affect policy and which ones don't affect policy?
Well, I mean, policy in what sense? What, like, the general policy?
Like international relations from the standpoint of India.
Well, the way international relations of India works is there's a permanent bureaucracy that has existed since Indian independence. That bureaucracy was inherited from the British, and prior to that, it was inherited from inherited from the internal bureaucracies of the Rajas. And the
Yeah.
Rajas also had their own standalone bureaucracy separate from the British under the British Raj. But this permanent bureaucracy is very much focused on the national security interests of India.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of interplay with the diplomatic services of India and the economic interests, the businesses, the military. And you've had a lot of politicians in India like align themselves with this permanent bureaucracy. And it's very interesting that a lot of the top Indian politicians, they have that connection to the bureaucracy. These extreme groups in India, I'll just give one example. The Communist Party of India has historically been funded, backed, and propped by Mao Zedong in China.
Yeah.
And the goal was to get the Communist Party of India to essentially move India towards a heavy pro-Chinese direction.
Yeah.
But that never worked out in the Cold War because when China encroached on India's borders, that changed the perception of China in that country. And if you were a communist and you were looking at the Chinese as some kind of friend, some kind of great country to, work with, emulate the revolution with, you were seen as like a traitor. And the CPI, even had a split over this issue. You had Maoists in India say, no, India is acting imperialistic. They're defending borders drawn by the British, blah, blah, blah. But that opinion didn't really hold much sway. Whereas the communists who were not pro-Chinese, they were like, okay, forget China. Yeah. And actually, those communists were more friendly to the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they actually had quite a bit of pull in India. And the Congress Party of India, which was always anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, generally anti-Western, they had been, shifting to the left. That was because of the way they could access, they couldn't access all the top weapons from the West. And the Soviet Union was willing to do that.
Yeah.
Those communist elements were starting to challenge the Congress Party in the state and local governments. And so Congress embraced socialism much more to ensure its electoral viability, because the Congress Party is heavily based in the south of India, and those communists are also in the south of India. So the point I'm getting to is, to some extent, the extreme groups can have some influence, but I don't know if it's as great as we think. I mean, India was already pro-Soviet Union in the Cold War.
Yeah.
The socialist faction of Congress.
Let's take that example then. So I think that's a good example where in every society there are people who might have some minority or extreme beliefs, and maybe they might find a home in the government, but they might not because, let's just say, hopefully greater minds win out in the end. And I think that might apply to what you said about China. True, there could be some intellectuals who are seeing China rise and thinking that, kind of like the Polish, now is our opportunity to seize this, that, and the other back and expand to our maximum borders or whatever. But when you get to the, real politics in China, they're going to be like, we need to take back Sakhalin Island. And the answer will be to start a third world war with Russia and essentially destroy everything we've built, that our ancestors have built, and die in a fiery nuclear ash. We'll be fine. I think that what you're kind of, with those guys, I think they're more the equivalent of when our feminists in the West write books about how if all men were dead, there would be no violence or something like that. Like, it's kind of in this kooky, I'll put it this way. It's the way that people who've never been in a fist fight think about war. You know, look all over. I'm sure if you look all over any social networks, there's always these people who love to draw the different maps with the what if or the potential division of this or that or whatever. I think it's just some sort of intellectual masturbation rather than an
Well,
actual Chinese policy.
China and India are both nuclear power states.
Yeah.
The Indians got their nukes because they were concerned about China's influence
Yeah.
over the subcontinent and their ability to destroy the hell out of India if they chose.
Yeah.
But despite them both being nuclear powers, that hasn't stopped China from salami slicing India's northeast and India's north. It hasn't stopped them at
Well, what
all.
allows them to actually take a part of India? What is it?
What allows them to do it is the fact that there is not enough adequate intelligence in India to see what the Chinese are doing in real time.
I see.
And so what the Chinese end up doing is they build these border towns near India's borders. They have these very quick pop-up little military installations.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is they sneak in or they put their developments over the border. And, when the Indians fight back or try to repel, the Chinese fight back. And they end up compromising in the end. And the Chinese, they unfortunately, from my point of view, they end up winning in some of these instances and eating up more of that border. And it's slow and steady gobbling up of Indian land. They do this in the South China Sea, the same thing, where they will build these little military installations, these artificial islands. It'll grow. And it just, it's so small, so insignificant, but it's consequential. And no one is willing to go and fight the Chinese over it because that would trigger war. And the Chinese know that, and they do it anyway. And there's really no effective deterrence to this. And also because China trades like crazy, has so much influence over these countries. No capital does not want to offend China. They don't want to, the governments don't want to piss off China. And I see the Russians getting very heavily economically dependent. And then I see these Chinese, respected leaders musing about, not necessarily going in one go and getting these Russian lands, but having the ability to take some small bites and get away with it because they know the Russians can't fight back, especially considering the fact the Russians are getting sanctioned like crazy by the West. They're dumping their ammo in the West, in the Ukraine. They're getting more isolated and they're getting more dependent. I don't know if that conversation is happening or not.
No, but again, the Russian border is the most militarized and heavily, the strongest probably border in the world. I'll put it this way. If they tried to do that here, they'd all be dead. Because the Russians, somehow they know when a human being crosses the border. I don't know how they do it, but they know. It's one of those things where it's kind of like try it. Because people have tried, especially people with cameras, to sort of do stuff like that. They always know. They always get people. So essentially, if there were people to sort of go over the border, having the river there certainly helps to define the border. But if they were to start doing that, they would either be arrested or shot on sight.
But could the Russians do that knowing that they don't have many allies and they're getting pretty hosed with the sanctions and the trade?
No one's getting hosed by sanctions. Things are awesome here. We're the best economy in Europe right now.
There is a loss of trade between Russia and Europe.
Yeah.
There's a loss of revenue.
Well, I don't know. I'm not worried about it in the slightest, man.
Well, that's fine, and that's okay. But I just think the Russians, they're gonna get way too dependent on the Chinese, and the Chinese are gonna exploit that, just like they've done with India. There's a huge trade imbalance between India and China. It's insane.
Well, I'll put it this way: there's really what else can Russia do? There's not much. I mean,
well, this is what I wanted to get into the conversation about.
Yeah.
So we have an interesting candidate called Vivek Ramaswamy. He's running for president of the United States. He has this crazy idea that he can pull Russia and China apart from each other and advocate that America and Russia have a common foe, being China. America doesn't want to lose its hegemonic status to China, and the Russians are getting way too dependent on China. And that dependency could lead to abuse in the same way China has abused the Philippines with their border disputes, the way they've abused India, the way they're abusing certain relationships with other countries in the South China Sea. And so I wonder how that, I don't know if Ramaswamy's idea, how it's well received. I did recently watch some Russian television. I forget the name of the channel. I think it's Russia One, if I'm not mistaken. And they were all kind of, oh yeah, cool. Vivek Ramaswamy is just another Trump guy. He might, be a good candidate. But I wonder if this policy proposition is being taken with any other, with some consideration.
No, I mean, everyone's focused on the war.
Yeah.
The war really casts a shadow on everything. So, yeah.
Too much bad blood.
I don't know about bad blood. It's just that's what is the number one issue. We have to resolve this. After the war is over, kind of that's what's really going to, about this issue that you're saying, a dependence on China. Well, it also really depends after the war is over, what is Europe going to be like? How is Europe going to relate to Russia and other such nations, the United States? Again, if the United States were to go through some sort of major transformation in terms of the way it interacts with the rest of the world, Russia could maybe try to reforge connections with America. But as long as the war is going on, it's impossible. So you can't really think about it. It's like, okay, well, Russia's too dependent on China. Well, Russia's already trying to sell a lot of energy and other such resources to India. It's trying to do the same thing to Africa. It's also trying to do the same thing to South America, so that's already happening. But South America and Africa, certainly, although they are big markets in theory, they don't seem to yield nearly as much as easily as China does. So it's kind of one of these things, is the planet is only so big, there's only so many civilizations, and Russia's kind of stuck with China one way or the other.
That's exactly. I'm glad you have this observation, because this is the thing. I know the Russians know this. Otherwise, they would not be going out of their way to increase their trade with non-Chinese countries. And they know this. They know this. They're afraid of this. And I just wonder if there is any conversation about what would happen if we get too swallowed up by the Chinese. Because even look at America. They can't even fight the Chinese much. They really can't. Their own defense companies have actually talked about how it's not as easy as we think to decouple from China. And in fact, we shouldn't. You say that you see Elon Musk building factories in China. I mean, despite the fact that Chinese have gone after America over intellectual property, they've gone after them hard on the trade secrets. They've, done a lot of cybersecurity attacks. The Chinese are bullying all of America's allies. Still, America and China, America and China.
I'll put it this way. There's something we also have to forget, is that China has certain major problems. And Russia is also a solution. So it's not that China is the solution to Russia's problems, but Russia is a lot of the solutions to China's problems. Because China, for example, probably the most famous examples you'll see on the internet all over the place, is it's not just motor oil that Russia ships to China, it's cooking oil. And they ship it really expensive, by the way. But China is so desperate for things like cooking oil that they're willing to pay Russians maybe 5 or 6 times its value on the shelves here for it. To be honest, if China actually is facing some sort of like downturn or recession, and at the same time they seem to be unable to feed themselves, well, if the West is going to sanction China and Russia were to pull out, they could actually face a real significant hunger crisis. And crisis in many, many more ways. So again, it's kind of this thing where with other countries, with the Philippines, can someone pick on the Philippines without consequences? Yes. Can someone pick on China or the United States or Russia without consequences? Not so much. And so I think that a lot of these things don't really particularly apply to Russia. But you keep asking whether there's a conversation about it within Russia. I would say generally no. But again, the thing that you have to understand is Russians are only have rose-tinted glasses, or whatever that stupid expression is, for the West. They're extremely skeptical, reasonable, and rational about the entire rest of the planet. Okay? So people do not at all, in the slightest here, act towards the Chinese, or again, it doesn't matter, Chinese, Africans, Argentinians, who cares? It is a completely different way of doing things. The sucker Russia of the 1990s is a complete response to the 300 years of the propaganda that the West is inherently superior, and the sort of Cold War era propaganda that being obedient to the West is the pathway to wealth. Okay? That idea was very much so, as I mentioned already before, injected across the Soviet Union. So it's sort of like, can you really be suckered in by someone you have zero trust for? You see what I mean?
I think I
It's kind of
understand
like
what
with
you
me,
mean.
like we're both men, right? So say there's some sort of gorgeous woman, and I'm what if I was 20 years younger again? And it's like, oh, I'm so lonely. Oh, this chick's so hot. Could this person manipulate me? Maybe, yeah, sure, she's hot and all this stuff. Say some old elderly woman who comes walking by who's some kind of con artist. I'm like, well, lady, you're not so sexy. You have no power over me. You know, it's just different. It's again, so that's why I don't worry about this very much, because Russians are so skeptical of anyone who's not from the West.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess I have one last question that I'd love your thoughts on for our
Sure.
viewers. If there was such a proposition, America comes to Russia and says, "Hey, you gotta pull your relationship with China. We'll freeze the lines of conflict in Ukraine. You gotta remove your nukes from Kaliningrad. You've got to remove your naval. You've got to remove your naval bases and so on and so forth from Latin America and America's sphere of influence. You've got to stop pointing your weapons at Europe and NATO. America will also retreat back from Poland and remove some of their weapons systems. America will open up the spigot, start trading with Russia, giving them money they need, remove all the sanctions, make life very beautiful for the Russians. And there's some more to the Vivek's plan. Would Russia take that in exchange for dumping China?
No. What would happen is, in all likelihood, it would go into like a gray zone where they would just discuss it and discuss it and discuss it forever with nothing ever actually happening. That would probably be the most likely response.
Why wouldn't they take the deal? I mean, they'd be rebuilding their relations with the West.
The
They'd be getting
biolabs,
wealthy.
man.
Oh God.
The biolabs, that ended anything. That plus the whole Ukrainian situation and all that.
But they'd be free.
Essentially, for Russia to be able to make some kind of deal like that with the United States, it would require the United States. Like I said, I think it could be done with a lot of propaganda. But one thing that unfortunately would be a lot faster, if there was an actual revolution in the United States that the Russians considered to be a real legit revolution, then they'd do it.
So you're basically saying, because of all that bad blood between Russia and the United States, the Russians would be too damn skeptical.
Yeah, the Russian elite and all that would just be like, no. Then the men in Ukraine died for nothing.
But they'd get the lines frozen. The war would end. That's significant. Less Russians would die.
Well, if you're talking about getting the war to end, there is definitely a desire with Putin to sort of get the war to end.
Yeah.
But the problem then they created with China could be worse than that from his standpoint. So, nah, because essentially there's really no way that they could do that. And especially the United States, the way it functions, they're not. It would really require the United States to fulfill all of its side of the of this agreement, fulfill all of them before Russia would even fulfill like the first step of it. And no one in the United States would ever do that, no matter what the cost.
The proposal is that Russia and China end their military alliance, where they have some obligation to defend each other.
Again, it doesn't really provide that much benefit. You know, like...
I mean, I don't see the Chinese doing much for the Russians in Ukraine, other than some weapons transfers, some protections in the United Nations Security Council, some nice rhetoric, cute rhetoric here nor there.
Okay, then how about this? What if Ramaswamy comes out and he has a proposal to Russia and essentially the world that the conflict in Ukraine is going to end, and the United States submits to a multipolar world order that'll be drawn up between the United States and Russia and all that. If the United States were to submit to that and really deeply reorganize its overseas forces or something of that nature. But the thing is, anything that would be needed to be done would be so extreme on the side of America that it wouldn't be feasible.
Yeah.
You know, America's like Russia could say then, okay, we're going to have no base. We're going to not build a base in Guatemala. It's always this weird thing. Some people say there's a base in Vietnam and some say there isn't. So I don't know if there's a Vietnam base. The base in Syria, okay. So Russia has to close all of its foreign bases. So then the United States is going to close all, what is it, 800?
No. The proposal isn't that Russia closes all of its bases. It closes bases that are in America's backyard in Latin America.
Well, but again, one of the reasons why did this war again actually start? It go from this horrible situation that I called the Ukrainian crisis to being a war. On, I believe it was like January 1st, actually on New Year's, I think, or was it January 10th when they submitted, or January 10th when they got rejected? My memory sucks. But anyways, in January of 2022, the Russians actually gave their final sort of offer a sort of proposal about what to do about the Ukrainian crisis. And essentially what they asked was, let's go back in time to the 1990s, relook at the map of NATO, and let's push these borders back, and let's maybe redraw this map and discuss where we're going to have our defenses, where you're going to have your defenses. Who's going to be in NATO? Who could be in sort of a buffer zone? The United States categorically and unilaterally rejected every point without discussion. Yeah, and that's where we're at today. So essentially, that deal that the Russians wanted before the conflict would be something that Ramaswamy would have to offer. But this time it would be global. It wouldn't be about Europe. It would be about globally reorganizing and making a deal, I guess, between Russia and China, and I would presume India as well, about what American foreign policy and its defense and territories and spheres of influences would actually look like. And there is no way that would ever happen.
Well, that Russian deal, I'm sorry to say, and like, I'm not trying to diss the Russians, but that was like
go ahead.
No. I actually like Russia. I wish more people liked Russia. I don't agree with everything, but, I'm not. Put it this way, I see a good future in which Russia and the West can team up to stop Chinese hegemony, because Chinese hegemony already exists in Asia. And like it or not, America is an Asian power. And that's part of the reason why America has hostilities with China. And the more countries that work in this checking of Chinese hegemonic status, they would be better for the world, because if the Chinese start writing the rules, well, I don't know if the same level of economic prosperity will be enjoyed by free enterprise. I think the Chinese will definitely go for getting as much land grab, resource grab, financial transfers to their government, not to, international trade. But anyway, and the global companies. But anyway, the point I was getting here was that I think the package that Russia proposed was preposterous because there was a lot of agreements that the United States and Russia had agreed on in terms of, um, where certain like borders would be agreed on, where systems would be placed. They have like a NATO Russia Council.
Yeah.
The Russians did have a lot of problems with what NATO was doing, but they didn't like stop it. They didn't like put their foot down.
Mm-hmm.
Some of their opposition was ignored, and Russia folded. And NATO kept going. The systems, missile systems, weapon systems kept going. You know, thing is that when the Russians were like, okay, look, you have to, here's the deal. We're not going to do anything with this Ukraine thing if you accept all of these things. It was like, well, America was never going to accede to that anyway,
Mm-hmm.
because it already pushed, in that direction. And they've already seen the Russians not do much or put up much of a fight. So it's like, okay, what are you doing, Russia? Like, that you never really fought against these things, these NATO, enlargements and weapon systems. You never really did anything about it, nor could you. Now, all of a sudden, you want us to accept it, knowing full well that you're going to be powerless to resist us. And you expect us to just give away our edge here over Ukraine? I don't think so. So I think the Russians knew the West that the United States would never give up.
Especially the entire their proposal was written from the standpoint of this very, again, realpolitik, pessimistic view of the world, where essentially, when you talk to the United States, NATO is officially a group of allies, okay? And the United States has to see NATO as a group of voluntary allies who are all, partners in this big organization. Whereas, of course, the Russians are just like Poland is nothing, and so is Austria. Well, Austria's not NATO.
No.
And so is, Germany and now Finland. They're just nothing. So essentially, it was a more of an appeal to a very 1800s way of looking at spheres of influence and territory and all that. Perhaps that was some sort of trolling or message sending. I'm not sure, but I agree with you that it was definitely not written to be appealing or get approved.
Yeah. The thing is, America was able to get all of these gains in Europe, and they got away with it because the Russians couldn't do anything, and they didn't really put much of an effective opposition, which is very strange. Boris Yeltsin was an interesting leader.
Well, I'll tell you, because it's simple, because the Soviet leadership, especially near the end, from Brezhnev till the end, loved and loves America more than Russia by far. It's that simple.
Now, I would argue it's Gorbachev that really changed the things. I mean, Brezhnev was much more militaristic and much more hostile.
But deep down, they were all aware of those nice Hollywood houses, because it's hard to really express just how poor communism made people, and so it really allowed them to sort of only see America through the lens of their own desperation for material stuff. Yeah. So
the thing is, the Russians knew America would never give up all these gains. It was like they would just not give it up. I mean, they never gave up. For heck's sake, they weren't going to give it up when they proposed and implemented these measures in terms of going east. America got away with it. Yeah. Now all of a sudden they're gonna walk from it.
Well, again, dude, we're going to get a little bit into a circle here with you, because it's hard to really explain just how, as again, someone who's an American who's been on all these Russian political talk shows and been on the worked on the radio and all this stuff. I can tell you, they do not understand the United States, the West in general, but they don't understand the United States. The real people. I don't want to really diss on Lavrov. Maybe he has some because he's been doing this, but they just don't get it. They do not understand how to express an idea to an American or sell an idea or the methodology to really maybe try to actually really troll someone and poke away at them. Like they don't even really understand how to. I'll put it this way: if they were to say, they don't even know how to say something hateful to someone. It's something like again, someone goes up to you and you're like, "You curry muncher." That's like, because curry is the only thing they know about India, and you're like, "Wow, that was a really ineffective racial slur." You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure, I don't want to get into it, but I'm sure there's some really hurtful things that you could think of to, address Indians with if we really sat down and got creative. And Russians don't know. They're like that. They don't get anything about the way that American power works, the way the mentality, especially they sort of get the way like your average American, your average conservative American, they kind of get him a little bit, but they think that that's the people who are in power, and they're just not. Like they don't know, they don't understand how a Victoria Nuland could exist. This is something beyond their comprehension. She might as well be some sort of like 5-headed demon from another dimension. She's just beyond their,
I hear you. It's just the way that West perceived that agreement was just like, it's so laughable. No one was gonna like. Anyway, I don't want to get into the circle, but I'll just finish the point, which is, so it's like a maximalist demand the Russians brought, and the way the West interpreted was, you and I both know this is crazy. You basically are giving us an ultimatum that no one can really accept.
Yeah.
And this is going to lead to war, essentially. And that's what you really want in the end. You come up with a ridiculous idea so that you can claim that you tried to have, peace. Yeah. In reality, you wanted war, and you knew you wanted war because you were wanting war, because you gave this ridiculous idea that no one could agree to. And that's why, when I listen to some talk show host about how, Russia gave this great deal to the West, it's like,
No. It was a deal that no politician could ever agree to.
Yeah, exactly. It was a poison pill.
I'll put it this way: it would be the type of agreement that America could agree to if America had a complete economic collapse.
Correct. Exactly. Like that. Absolutely. Like, why would this victorious nation with this burgeoning empire give up over Ukraine? I mean, and that's the thing too.
And then the weird part about that is then Putin goes in with the initial part of the special military operation with only 90,000 troops, very mobile. Remember the first 2 months of the war, very very mobile. Which again, if we are to believe the opinion of Colonel McGregor there, and I guess Scott Ritter would also be part of that this was sort of to send a message to the West that they were serious. Which again, when you're sitting here, where you and I are both Americans. It's like that is absolutely not our reasoning. Like that is a 0% effective message sent. Okay, we're gonna go in and we're gonna in a really mobile way, I guess, fight kind of like the way that what's it's called, Al Nusra and all those others. It's just. It was like, basically, guess what? We're going to fight you like a African colony fought the British. Really mobile and on a small scale. If they would have in the first month used the 500 kilogram bombs that they've used on a few different sites, rather in the second half of the war, in the first month, especially in locations that would have been media noticeable, perhaps that would have been like, oh, now they're serious. Infantry are not serious. 500 kilogram bombs that are precision guided are different.
Well, I really appreciate your takes, and my God, I could keep going with the questions because this is really fascinating. But I want to thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd want to close with? Just you'd like to say? Anything.
Want to close with is perhaps I've lived in Russia too long, and I myself am a little bit pessimistic here, but I guess you can never really give up on the attempt to find peace. But again, maybe let's take something that sort of combines your concerns and combines like my concerns and Russia's concerns. Is the whole thing about a multipolar world, and if it's to work, is there has to be multiple poles of power. And again, what you're saying about the concern of Chinese hegemony is a little bit concerning, because remember, we were supposed to work out a BRICS currency, but all I'm starting to see is a lot of trading in yuan.
That's what I'm saying.
And so we are in a little bit of a risk zone where we're going from one bad option of a global hegemon, because no one can be the global hegemon. There's no such group of people that is so wonderful and moral and upright that they're going to behave themselves. And so, I definitely think that we in Russia should be concerned with some of the things you've said, and we have to create a multipolar world and not help China win a new Cold War to create a Chinese century and fall right back into the same situation that Russia's been in for a long time.
Because in the Congress of China, they did say by 2049, we're going to correct all of our historical grievances. Mm-hmm. This is not verbatim. This is paraphrasing and interpreting. And I ask myself, well, some of these unequal treaties includes the treaties between China and Russia. Yeah. And these Chinese claims, land claims, they're all mostly from the Qing dynasty. And I find it preposterous that China and Russia can just bury the hatchet. It's all good. I think that Pandora's box is going to open up again. And what triggers it, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, yes, Russia is behaving nicely with China. They're allowing the Chinese to mine their regions. They're they're letting the Chinese workers come in, exploit the land, take up the jobs, develop Russia, get the resources. But there'll be a day when Russia has to act in its interests that might be contrary to China. For example, Russia has an excellent relationship with India. The Indians are very concerned they will not get the arms they need against China in a future conflict, because Russia will need to balance the two. But then the Russians know that they're so damn dependent on China that if they don't help out India, then they're going to stay swallowed in with this Chinese relationship. And they also don't want to lose that Indian relationship, because India is going really hard into America's orbit. They're signing agreement after agreement.
I mentioned to you earlier, that despite the fact that Russia can sell a lot of stuff now to sub-Saharan Africa and to South America, it doesn't seem to quite have the same amount of yield. And that's another thing with the multipolar world is, so the richer India becomes, the safer again the world becomes, because again we have to have multiple poles, and the multiple poles have to be, so essentially if you're a person who believes in multipolarity, you want to have a few different rich regions of the world, because say the United States, let's say God forbid, completely just has some sort of a cultural and systemic meltdown. Well, that's actually then not good, because then that essentially leaves super China and a sort of half pole of Russia and a half pole of India. And then what? It's going to be an Indo-Russian alliance and maybe some new Cold War against the Chinese. That'll just be really sad.
Well, that's what happened in the Cold War. The Soviet Union and India paired together against communist China. Yeah. And that relationship is one that Indians miss. They don't like this whole Russia-China thing. Yeah. They don't like how they're getting so damn chummy. They're really afraid. And that is actually what's pushing India hard into the American orbit. Yeah. Something the Russians should consider. And more importantly, to the point, it's not just that the Chinese want to be a world hegemonic power. It's not just that the Chinese have a greater diplomatic footprint than the United States does, which is really interesting. It's not just that the Chinese do salami slicing. It's not just the Chinese have this nationalism inside of them, but there's this undercurrent in China, underbelly of hate to all of the nations that wronged them long, long ago. Yeah. And I think the Russians, with all due respect, they're not thinking the long term. Mm-hmm. They really aren't. Maybe they are. That's why they're trading like crazy with other non-Chinese nations. Yeah. But I think they might have to wrap this Ukraine war up. They need the Europeans. They need that cash.
Yeah.
But
let's hope this
I
all
don't
gets
know.
wrapped up and we get back to
It'll
business.
be interesting. It'll be interesting. Maybe, there's other proposals out there, which is, we can end the Ukraine war by destroying Russia. We can sow secessionism in Russia, and that's what Ukraine is trying to do, in the West,
They're not
backing
going
them.
so well. All right, man. Good
All
talking
right, thank you for your time. Take care.
Take care.